Welcome everyone to this webinar. My name is Ben Bland. I'm the director of the Asia Pacific program at Chatham House in London. Thanks so much for joining us today for this discussion about how India's democracy shapes its relationships with the West. This event has been designed to coincide with the launch of a new paper by Touted, our senior research fellow for South Asia. And his new paper looks at the interconnections between India's political system at home and its foreign, particularly its expanding relationships with key Western democracies like the US and the UK and Australia. As Indians prepare to go to the polls in the world's biggest election, there's obviously been a lot of focus on the qualities and shortcomings of India's democracy. And at the same time, we see here in London very much how Western governments are keen to frame their deepening engagement with India through this lens of democratic partnership. But as Chittige's paper argues, this approach really risks misreading both the drivers of Indian politics at home and its foreign policy, and thereby undermining these Western efforts to get closer to India. To discuss the broader questions about the role that democracy plays in Indian foreign policy, we're delighted to be joined by Chittige himself, the author of the paper, and two other eminent experts. So Kate Sullivan de Estrada is an associate professor in the International Relations of South Asia at the University of Oxford. And Ambassador Rakesh Sood is a former senior Indian diplomat who served as ambassador to Afghanistan, France, and Nepal, as well as permanent representative at the Conference on Disarmament in Geneva. Their full bios are online if you want more information about their many and various distinguished achievements. Just a reminder before we get going that today's session is being recorded. I'm going to ask questions to the panelists for about 35 minutes, and then we're keen to turn to you all for your questions. If you have questions, please put them in the Q&A box on Zoom, which you all know about, and tell us your name and any affiliation you have. So keen to get as many of your questions as possible, so start putting them in early. Chittige, I want to come to you first as the author of this new paper. You've only been at Chatham House for 6 months, but you're off to a flying start with a really interesting piece of work. What prompted you to write this particular paper?
Thanks, Ben, and hello, everyone. So I think, when we discuss India today, there are really two key narratives that I see. One is on the rise of India as an increasingly prominent geopolitical actor, and the other is on concerns about the state of its democracy. So what this paper attempts to do is examine the interplay or the intersection between these two narratives, to ask, what does India's democratic credentials say about its global role and its relations with the West? And it's interesting that when you look at the West really holds up India's democratic credentials as one of its key pillars of its engagement with the country. Almost every joint statement that you see between India and a Western country begins with the preamble that refers to a shared democratic heritage as the basis for deepening cooperation. And the paper refers to several examples of this. And India also likes to tout its status as the world's largest democracy as justification for it to have an expanded role on the world stage. So whether it be a permanent seat on the UN Security Council, or India referring itself to, quote unquote, the mother of democracy during its G20 presidency last year, that is also, I think, a prominent theme. And all of this may seem rhetorical, but I think it does have practical implications. So I think the West holds India up to different standards from other partners, such as, say, Vietnam or Saudi Arabia, where the relationship is purely transactional. So it's not just shared interests, but also shared values. So essentially, this is the question I'm trying to ask is, what does India's democratic status mean for the country's foreign policy and its engagement with the West? What are the areas of convergence and divergence? And what does it mean from a policy perspective?
Thanks, Chittige. Ambassador Sood, I might come to you next as a very experienced practitioner of India's foreign policy, someone steeped in the various traditions of how India engages with the world. I mean, when you look back now on your career, I mean, how would you characterize the ways in which India has sought to execute its foreign policy? That we hear these different terms like non-alignment in the past, multi-alignment, strategic autonomy. What was your sense when you were doing the real work of diplomacy on the ground of what the driving forces were?
Thank you, Ben. And let me thank Chatham House for inviting me for this webinar. I went through Chittige's paper with great interest. And, I have been a career diplomat for 38 years that I spent in government. I have never been a minister. I've never been a politician. So let me say that, as Kshitij says very rightly, he says, there's a joint statement that comes out at the conclusion of a high-level visit, a speech by the Prime Minister, or a joint press interaction by the two foreign ministers that happens from time to time. Now, but I think that when I have met my counterparts, senior officials in foreign offices in different countries, Western countries, whether it is Washington, whether it is London, whether it is France, in Paris or Berlin or Tokyo, or, not once have we actually started a conversation by saying that I represent the largest democracy and you represent the oldest, or, whatever it may be, or that with the Japanese, that we are the two democracies of Asia, or no. I mean, it's a far more practical, realist manner in which we conduct foreign policy. However, as democracies, it is important that we address different constituencies in our countries when we come out with a joint statement. And politicians make statements to address multiple constituencies, as you know, domestic constituencies, foreign constituencies, and so on. And so therefore, there is a finite, and therefore quite naturally the joint statement will start, or speeches will begin by talking between India and US about the largest democracy, the oldest democracy, things like that. And, but these are, I'm not saying this is mere gloss. No, that's not the case. But at the same time, in the practical day-to-day work of diplomacy, this doesn't figure in. Yet, when I sit down with my counterpart to draft the joint statement, yes, I will start with an opening paragraph like that. So I think we need to make a distinction as to what is put out as democracies to address multiple constituencies and how the actual business is conducted, how the actual business of democracy is conducted. When we have differences over trade, or if over strategic issues or anything like that, that, let me just flip the question, and I think that would be the best way. That would be, I'll conclude on that note. How much did democracy, after all, India has been a democracy since it became independent, since 1947. How much did democracy shape Western foreign policy towards India in the last 75 years? And if we think of that, I think we get an answer. Today, there is a different engagement. That engagement is driven by other factors, because the democracy factor is not something new in our relationship. Britain was a democracy in 1947. US was a democracy in 1947. Yes, some of the other, Japan wasn't. Japan was an occupied country at that time. But say from the 50s onwards, we have had, a strong democratic movement in Western Europe, or in the West largely. But the content, the quality of the relationship that we had was very different from what it is today. I hope that point, I mean, I will end there, and maybe others can take it on from here.
Yeah, I mean, Kate, I might come to you on that question. I mean, it's a good one, because it does seem to me that the renewed Western interest in engaging with India does seem to be much more driven by pragmatic factors of geopolitics, largely the search for strategic hedges against China on security, also on economics. But yeah, what's your sense from the other side, from the West? Despite putting this language in statements, is there something deeper, do you think, in how the West sees India through this lens of democracy, accepting, of course, that all foreign policy is a mix of interests and values. I think we have to take that as a given rather than relitigate that one.
I mean, I think I would respectfully disagree with the ambassador here. I don't think that democracy is, a characteristic or a trait that India has and that can be, objectively assessed and then sort of set aside. I mean, referring to Kshitij's excellent paper as well as the ambassador's comments just now. I think it's something very relational. It's caught up in particular with Western ideas of democratic kinship. That is of hopes and aspirations around whether India belongs to that kinship group of democracies. I think the very blunt question that many Western policymakers are asking themselves at this geopolitical moment you just mentioned is, is India one of us? Does India now belong to a family of democracies whose shared identities mean that they have common kind of group goals, that each member can be depended on to behave in service of the group? Rather than their own interests. And that question's particularly salient because of India's studied neutrality towards Russia's invasion of Ukraine, of course. So that kind of threw the idea of India belonging to this kinship group, I think, into question. And I would say there are a couple of reasons why that matters. I mean, the first is that when a country sort of seems unpredictable, and I'm talking from the perspective of the West here, not my own perspective, when a country seems unpredictable, then issues of trust arise. And trust is actually quite crucial when you're trying to build strategic convergence against a common threat or enemy. And the second reason why that sort of kinship being thrown into question matters is because the kind of narrative of a liberal rules-based order gets a bit delegitimized when the world's largest democracy is not clearly on the same page as, Western liberal democracies who are, of course, trying to meet the authoritarian challenge from Russia and China. So I see democracy as much more relational, I think, than as something that we can bracket off because a materialist view of the world is somehow more persuasive in its explanatory power of how things work.
Yeah, it's interesting because it gets to one of my sort of hobby horses, which is that countries that build alliance systems don't really understand non-alignment and vice versa. I think it's very hard for independent countries with their own foreign policy to think, why would the UK and US and Canada and New Zealand share intelligence with each other? That's crazy. And equally, I think it's very hard, as you're saying, Kate, for G7 countries to understand why India takes position A on this, position B on something else, position C on another issue, which isn't to say that India shouldn't take those positions, as you're saying, but just that I think there is a confusion on the part of the West in trying to make sense of that. Ambassador Sood, I know you want to come back in on this, so the floor is yours.
Thank you. The term Western liberal order or rule-based order, I think this is a term that I found that was coined by or used by John Eikenberry towards the end of 1990s. Didn't exist during the Cold War, as it were. And then I think I found a reference saying that the New York Times first used it in 2012. Somehow or the other, the term Western rule-based liberal Western order got conflated because this was the unipolar moment with the global international rules-based order. I don't know how it got converted, but it is understandable to see that because it was a unipolar world, it got converted into a global rule-based order. Graham Allison has called it a myth. I'm sure you would have seen Graham Allison's piece in Foreign Affairs a few years ago, where he said that this was the idea of a global international rules-based order is a myth. And frankly, it is one, because, as I said, if countries that were united by democracy, then surely it could have existed during the bipolar world also, but it didn't. So what was driving it was interests. Now, the bipolarity of that time put certain values of democracy one side. Of course, even then, in summit level statements, it found a reference. But the emerging tensions today, somehow or the other, put India on the same side. And so therefore, those references seem more important. Insofar as Ukraine or, the differences in that is concerned, I don't think many people in the West understand. I had this conversation with some Ukrainians. The Ukrainian foreign minister was in town recently in Delhi. And he was very clear. There was no criticism on the purchase of, let's say, oil from Russia. And let me tell you, the reason why we do this, because the EU and the United States failed to persuade Saudi Arabia to increase its production. And if we were not buying this oil and not selling these petroleum products to the West, including Europe, including Ukraine for that matter, the inflationary pressures that Western countries would be facing would be far greater. So in a sense, yes, it is profiting India because we are buying oil at a cheaper price. And our refineries, whether in the public sector or in the private sector, are being able to export the petroleum products. But the biggest buyers of the petroleum products are the European countries, are the Western countries, and most particularly Ukraine. Otherwise, Ukraine, as I said, we've even exported petroleum products to the United States in the last 2 years. I mean, which is unusual if you look at the US as the largest producer of oil and gas. So I think that there is a little bit of a media-created myth about India's stand on Ukraine.
Okay. Kate, I might just come back to you quickly, and then I'll move the conversation forward after that.
Oh, I mean, just to, really reinforce the importance of looking back at history, as Ambassador Sood has done. And I think he posed a really interesting question, both in the comments he's just made and the earlier ones about, well, the United States and India were democracies throughout the Cold War. They are today. Why do we see this variation in the quality of the relationship? And I think, the answer is during the Cold War, the United States was caught in this ideological battle between, liberalism and communism, and communism was immoral. The United States was righteous in its liberalism, and India was a kind of challenge to the idea that all democracies naturally come together to fight against communism in its non-aligned stance. So I think that, in a way, that kind of the way that democracy plays into geopolitics at that time explains that gap. At the moment, certainly the liberal international order is certainly mythical. That doesn't mean that actors on the Western side don't kind of buy into it and believe it. I think a more interesting way of thinking about how order is working and into the themes we're discussing is perhaps by thinking about John Mearsheimer's idea of a bounded order, where we currently have the sort of democracies banding together to try to balance external threats. And I think there is still this real appetite for, a level of proximity, closeness, predictability, trust within that bounded order, which means that democracy is still very salient as those countries collectively pursue their interests in meeting that threat. And just to finally agree with the ambassador, absolutely, that, India of course, has to pursue its interests. The Western European critique, I think, and perhaps hypocrisy, one could say, on the issue of oil imports, I think is absolutely tied up with these anxieties of how proximate India is and how much it can be, in inverted commas, trusted from that particular standpoint.
Thanks, Kate. Kshitij, I want to dig a bit deeper into sort of what the Modi government actually wants in terms of its global role and the kind of linkages with domestic politics there, because we know that they talk about India as the mother of democracy, civilizational state, leader of the global south. I mean, how new are those kinds of framings? Haven't previous Indian governments made similar pitches? And I guess B, looking forward, what does the Indian government under Prime Minister Modi, if he's re-elected, what do they actually want to do? Saying we're a civilizational state and we have to play a bigger role on the world stage. What kinds of issues do they want to tackle? How much sort of political and actual capital are they willing to invest to deal with those problems?
So I think, first of all, it's interesting to note that foreign policy has historically not really been a very, key electoral issue for Indian elections. But what the Modi government has really managed to do is make Indians care more about India's place in the world. And how under his rule, India's status has been elevated, and India has developed a more assertive foreign policy. We saw this during the 2019 election, where national security was a key theme, which came in the aftermath of the Pulwama terrorist attacks in Kashmir in February of that year. This year comes a year after India's G20 presidency, and it should be noted that India's G20 presidency was actually delayed by a year to bring it closer to the election. And I think you're going to see a replay again in 2029. So with India's bid to host the COP climate change conference in 2028, so a year before the election. So you can see that this ability by the government to try and leverage its foreign policy accomplishments for electoral gain. I think that's whether it's its space program or its G20 presidency or its bid to host the 2036 Olympics. So I think that is very much first and foremost the driver behind India's this attempt to try and project India as a more prominent player on the world stage. I think related to that, I think its foreign policy priorities are closely related to making India a more attractive investment destinations, to help facilitate this push to make India a potential beneficiary of this push to de-risk or diversify supply chains away from China. So the push towards negotiating free trade agreements with several countries. We recently saw an agreement concluded with EFTA countries. So ongoing negotiations with the UK, EU, and several other countries. To basically make it a more investor-friendly climate. And then the other aspect of that is about, or that you alluded to, is about India being this so-called voice of the global South. I think India has really tried to promote itself as a potential bridging power between the advanced industrialized countries, the G7, and the emerging economies in the global South. And again, we saw this during the G20 presidency, with India hosting these Voice of the Global South summits, facilitating the African Union's entry into the G20. I think this has also been embraced to a large degree by the West in the view that India offers a more benign worldview that's non-Western, but not explicitly anti-Western. And we can see specific areas of cooperation, for instance, in the area of digital public infrastructure. But I think when push comes to shove, I think in large parts of the global South, China still remains the only game in town. So in terms of, India still lacks the economic heft that the Chinese have. So a lot of these initiatives are still on paper. They're still very much in their infancy. But I think there is this ambition of India to play a more prominent role in the global South. In some ways, it's reminiscent of the role it played in the 1950s as a leader of what was then referred to as the Third World, and then the non-aligned movement. The role it played, say during the Bandung conference. But I think what we see now is it's got a stronger ideological component, which is embedded in India's, or what the BJP refers to as India's civilizational identity. So we see this growing use of rhetoric of India as a Vishwa Guru, teacher of the world, or a Vishwamitra, a friend of the world, referring to India as Bharat. So I think there's several components to it. I think that it's first and foremost driven by domestic politics, showing the Modi government's ability to raise India's stature on the world stage, making India a more prominent or attractive investment destination. And then I think, the ideological component of making India a leader of the global South and a potential, a key pole of influence in the international system.
And Kate, I mean, on that point, what implications do you think the rise of the Hindu nationalist agenda within India have for foreign policy? We hear External Affairs Minister Jaishankar talk a lot about this civilizational state idea, and sort of taking a tougher stance when he's talking to Western journalists or Western think tank crowds. But what broader implications do you think that Hindutva has for India's foreign policy?
Just to concur with Kshitij that, foreign policy has made it into the domestic political space, I think, more than ever before under Modi's leadership since 2014. He has kind of domesticated foreign policy such that everything that happens, particularly around Dr. Jaishankar, is scrutinized and amplified and discussed and debated. I think there's, apart from clearly it being a way of legitimizing, mobilizing support for the BJP led leadership, I think there's also something more subtle going on. And I'd like to speak to the term mother of democracy, which Rhetoric, mentions in his paper. And I'd like to link it to my earlier point about, this idea of democracies as kind of a family that have a shared identity. We know that families are quite hierarchical, right? That there are originators of ideas and norms, and then there are kind of recipients. And, to kind of give an example of this, Ursula von der Leyen, so European Commission President in 2022 at the Raisina Dialogue, she said, democracy was born more than 2,000 years ago in Europe, but today its largest home is India. Now, there's quite a lot of sort of civilizational conceit wrapped up in that statement, of course. Some states are originators of democracy, other states are recipients. And we have this kind of hierarchical relationship within, the kinship democracy group. Now, when Modi says India is the mother of democracy, he is challenging that. He's suggesting, he's giving not only, I think, prominence to ideas of the polycentric origins of democracy, which I think are very important politically and ethically, and we need to engage with seriously. But he's actually advancing an argument about the primacy of India's democracy somehow being discovered in India first, before, thousands of years before other locations. And that primacy, I think, has two kind of, it causes two things. One, it doesn't put India in the category of a recipient, and therefore it's kind of beyond the reproach of Western states who are criticizing Indian democratic backsliding. The other thing is that it asserts India as somehow superior and as the teacher of democracy, which is a narrative which, of course, is hugely popular domestically. So there's definitely this international, I think, hierarchy denying thrust to a lot of this discourse, which, of course, is absolutely enjoyed, circulated and celebrated by many of the BJP's followers.
And practically, Ambassador Sood, how have you seen Indian diplomacy change with the rise and concentration of power of Prime Minister Modi? I mean, what do you see now that's different to previous administrations that you worked under?
Well, if I look at it in terms of what the foreign policy is trying to achieve, I would say that there is an enormous amount of continuity. Because the key objective of Indian foreign policy has always been to try and create a conducive external environment within which the people of India can prosper. I mean, we are still a very poor country. After 75 years, we are better off today than we were in 1947, but we still need a conducive political environment. So that implies what? That implies a focus on our neighborhood, which was there then and which is there today. I mean, we can question how effectively it has been implemented, the focus on the neighborhood. That's a different matter, but the focus on the neighborhood hasn't gone away. The focus with the larger neighborhood, the broader region, the Suez to Malacca kind of notion. We can talk about relations with the major powers. I mean, these have been sort of common, persistent, continuous factors driving Indian foreign policy. Now, at the same time, Modi has made a difference. And what has he done? Now, whether we can, I think this is more a difference in terms of presentation, style, and so on. First, he displays a much greater sense of self-confidence as compared, probably the first time since Nehru. I mean, Nehru strode the international stage when India was a much poorer country. And the world listened to Nehru. I mean, even if you go to the CTBTO website, the Test Ban Treaty website, you'll find in that Nehru's appeal for an end to testing as the first major international initiative which was taken, which he put out in a speech after the first hydrogen bomb test. So the point I'm making is that there is today a much greater sense of self-confidence in terms of the way Modi presents it, and of course, Foreign Minister Jaishankar presents it. The second, there is, again, similar to Nehru's time, there is a much greater focus on personality. I mean, Nehru was his own foreign minister. So in a sense, he was both prime minister and foreign minister. In this case, we have a very articulate foreign minister, and we have a very self-confident, forward-projecting prime minister. The third, I think, is that while the thing that Modi has done in his articulation is that he has tried to gain acceptance for India as a civilizational state. The point that Kate was talking about in terms of when we say mother of democracies, although I'm not necessarily convinced that, Modi is trying to sort of take credit for India as a democracy, but somehow or the other, India is an old civilization. And there have been civilizational contributions that India has made to sciences, to philosophy, to music, and, all of that. So, but Modi has been trying to present India and gain acceptance for India as a civilizational state. And this is more than just being a democratic state. More than just being a democracy, he's also talking about it as a civilizational state. And finally, I think there is a much more blunt articulation. Certainly, if you hear Foreign Minister Jaishankar, in terms of saying that foreign policy has to serve India's interests first and foremost. And, so in that sense, this is what is different. Now, whether this is difference of style or whether this is content, I would say that the objectives, there is an enormous amount of continuity because the objective of foreign policy hasn't shifted. India hasn't become an advanced country, a rich country, or anything like that. I think Kshitij made a good point when he said, and this, the point that Kshitij made, he said that, we were actually supposed to have the G20 a year earlier. We postponed it. We swapped with Indonesia because it played into the election in some fashion. Now, that is what I mean by style. And that is what I mean by the projection. So there, I agree with both Kshitij and Kate when they say that foreign policy is playing into domestic politics. I fully understand that and I fully accept it. But again, please see the realization. I think the first term that was being used was Vishwaguru, now, which means world teacher. And I think pretty soon, people realized in the top levels of the leadership, wherever, the term originated, perhaps this was being a little presumptuous. And so it switched to what? It switched to Vishwamitra, global friend, world friend, or Vishwabandhu, global brother. I mean, Bandhu is a friend, more than a friend, a brother, something like that. So there's a clear realization of limits of how far you can take this and how far you ought to take this, given the limitations in terms of your capabilities. So there is a continuity. And of course, there is a huge difference in terms of presentation and style.
Yeah, great. And on the point of capabilities, it's worth having a look at the Global Diplomacy Index published by my former employers, the Lowy Institute, which ranks kind of diplomatic presences of all the major powers in the world. And India is 11th in terms of the number of missions it has overseas. So behind traditional old powers like Italy, France, and Germany, but also behind other emerging powers like Brazil and Turkey. So I think Ambassador Sudit gets to your point, and I'm sure a common complaint of your MEA colleagues, at least in private, about a lack of resources for India's diplomatic network. But I want to move the conversation on, Kshitij, looking to the future. and particularly the future of India's relationships with the West. I mean, given some of these differences we're talking about, but the desire to expand the relationships too on both sides, where do you think the potential pitfalls are for the West and India? Obviously, we've seen the assassination of a Canadian citizen, allegedly by Indian security forces in Canada, a failed assassination of another US citizen, both involved in different kind of separatist activism that made the Indian government uncomfortable. That's one. So what's happening there, and what other pitfalls do you see in the years ahead, especially with this confusion in a way between values and interests in the relationship?
So I think, first of all, India, going back to the theme of the paper, India maintains a reluctance to engage in overt democracy promotion. So that means there's always going to be limits on the level of cooperation between India and the West, or based on their common democratic credentials. Add to that, then, concerns being supplemented by about the state of Indian democracy, about it emerging as an illiberal democracy or electoral autocracy, or whatever we want to call it, and signs of potential spillover of the government's Hindutva agenda into the foreign policy domain. As the government tries to promote India as a so-called civilizational state, I think there are potential concerns on the horizon. In the short term, I think India's imperfect democracy will trump China's one-party authoritarian state. So, and as long as India continues to be seen as a bulwark against the rise of China, concerns about democratic backsliding or concerns about India developing this more assertive foreign policy will continue to be downplayed, which is why despite these allegations of Indian complicity in the assassination of this Sikh or Canadian national on Canadian soil last year, the issue was in some ways almost swept under the carpet. It's almost forgotten, particularly by Canada's partners in the Five Eyes. But I think over the longer term, if we continue to see an erosion of India's democratic credentials, it could potentially prompt the West to rethink its cooperation with India in particular areas. So just to take as an example, the West currently is a strong supporter or advocate of India being a voice of the global South. But I think this is predicated on India being, a supporter of the rules-based international order, its status as the world's largest democracy. But if we see a weakening of these credentials, it could potentially undermine that narrative. Even in potentially, benign areas, say technology cooperation. Technology is not value neutral. So India's democratic credentials, its climate of openness and innovation, that's what's made it a preferred partner for Western countries over, say, China's techno-surveillance state. However, this could be subject to growing scrutiny if we see concerns over privacy or data protection, combining with broader concerns about democratic backsliding. So I don't think that's going to stop like policy-focused collaboration, so areas such as technology or energy or the military, but it could see limits on deeper collaboration in particularly sensitive areas such as intelligence sharing, for instance. The absence of democracy in Vietnam has not dented its attractiveness as an investment destination. So I don't want to put this, the whole, sort of narrative or issue of the relationship between India and the West just purely on the issue of democracy. So it's not really, and frankly, it's not actually a question of the quality of India's democracy, but to the extent to which this contributes to instability, undermines effective policy making, has a spillover effect into the foreign policy domain. I think those are some of the areas where you could, see growing frictions emerge. So I think both, as this, this attempt to develop India as a more civilizational state. In the India-Canada case, what we see is a growing assertiveness in the foreign policy domain, but also, and we can discuss this, the degree to which we could see the Hindutva agenda spilling over into the foreign policy domain. An example which potentially comes to mind is India's relationship with Israel, for instance.
I mean, on that point, Ambassador Sood, I might ask you about this. I mean, given the stated desire for India to play a bigger role, India is one of the few major countries that has good relations with many countries involved in disputes and conflicts right now, including Israel and Iran. So why haven't we seen India take a more kind of activist stance in trying to mediate some of these conflicts, where it has quite uniquely, really good relationships with people on all sides of the conflict, something that, China often doesn't have, the West rarely has?
I think conflicts of the kind that we are looking at today, when two conflicts like Ukraine, are rooted in a lot of history. If you listen to Putin's speech his famous article, his long speech, his long article that came out in 2021. I'm not saying that you have to accept it. That's not it. But it has a long history too. The same is true of the Israel-Palestinian conflict. I mean, where does history begin? Does it begin on October 7th? Where does it begin? And remember, India as a country was actually at that point in time, in 1947, 48, was opposed to the partition for the simple reason that it had itself suffered a partition in the name of religion. And we had diplomatic relations with Israel, but they were limited diplomatic relations in the sense that we did not have ambassadors in each other's capitals till 1992. It is only in 1992 that, that is the time after the Madrid process, there was peace talks and things like that. We had a Palestinian, a PLO ambassador based in Delhi from the 1980s. And at that time, it was considered a terrorist organization. Arafat could not go to address the UN General Assembly because the US would not give him a visa. So the UN General Assembly shifted to Geneva so that Arafat could address the UN General Assembly. So, some of these old conflicts, look, we ourselves have an old conflict, the Kashmir thing between India and Pakistan. And where do you start that? Do you start it in 1947? Where do you find the seeds of that partition? Do you find it in the call for a separate homeland for the Muslims of South Asia? Or do you go back to the creation of separate electorates in 1907 by the British who were ruling India at that time, or further back? So sometimes these conflicts are a little more difficult. And I think that it's probably just as well that we are, and I think that I follow this. And I do think that at this stage, we are not in a position to exercise that kind of influence. I mean, today we are seeing the limits of the influence that perhaps the United States, with its closest relationship with Israel, perhaps the country which has the closest ties with Israel, the country on which Israel is most dependent, not just for taking its back, but also providing it with military assistance and all the rest of it, is finding it difficult to persuade Prime Minister Netanyahu from leaving this whole thing. Will he retaliate? Will he not retaliate? Will that be escalatory? Will that not be escalatory? We've seen how many visits Secretary of State Blinken has made to the region to try and find a way out and hasn't succeeded. So but that apart, let me just say one thing about the global South, since that is also related to the point that you were making. I think global South is different from non-aligned movement. The non-aligned movement, because today, although we are seeing major rivalries emerge, it is not like one clear East-West divide. It is not like the Cold War of, ideological Cold War of East-West. Now, in an ideological Cold War of East-West, of the bipolar world, it was perhaps simpler for non-alignment to emerge as a policy, to create maximum space for maneuver for countries that did not want to get aligned. Today, if you look at the global South, and there's been enough written about the voting patterns in the UN General Assembly and things like that on these two conflicts, Ukraine and Gaza. You find that the global South, with approximately 100+ countries, there is one sentiment that unites them irrespective of where they tilt on each of these conflicts. And that is, they don't want to become collateral damage in these conflicts. And that sentiment is something that resonates with India.
Okay. All right. Understood. I think we might want to leave it there.
The last point, if I may, and I'll just take a couple of seconds on that, is that the country that has been trying to take advantage and position itself in the global south with its various initiatives, whether it is the Belt and Road Initiative, whether it is the Global Security Initiative, and a host of others, is China. And so obviously that is something that pushes us. And that is also something that the West sees, that, it is much better to have India in that kind of a position rather than China. I mean, because if the polarization between US and China, between West and China sharpens, then I think it would be not particularly helpful if China emerges as the voice of the global South.
Thanks. Sorry to rush, Ambassador. I just want to get in a few more questions from our audience. We've got quite a few now. The first one I want to ask is from Amanpreet Randhawa, and I might direct this to you, Kate, initially. How wise is it to confine the entire country's foreign policy to the charisma of one political leader?
Just a short answer to that. I don't think the entire foreign policy is confined to the charisma. I think that there are very salient issues that center around India gaining international recognition, the kinds of very visible performative diplomatic acts overseas, like being celebrated in different sports arenas by large numbers of Indian diaspora, key issues like Security Council seats and so on. I think these are kind of selected for their potential to be visible and politically salient, connect with a domestic audience. I think my personal opinion is that there's, even with the strong centralization of Indian politics under Modi, that has, of course, impacted the Ministry of External Affairs. I think there's still a lot of routinized foreign policy that's kind of going on in the background that isn't necessarily connected to his personal agenda as PM.
Thanks. Thanks, Kate. Chitij, I might come to you with the next one, which is from John Bezic, who asks, how important has Subramaniam Jaishankar been in presenting a specific Indian voice globally in support of the Modi government's international relationships? And I guess linked to that, I might just add, do you think he's likely to stay on as External Affairs Minister if, as expected, Prime Minister Modi wins another term?
Well, I'm not very fond of engaging in crystal ball gazing, and so I'm not sure. I mean, I think it's a near certainty or a foregone conclusion that we will have a third-term Modi government. I think it's, the key question or a watch point is, what is the strength of their mandate? Are they able to secure the 370 seat target that they're trying to get, and the 400 with coalition partners? On the I mean, we will probably see some changes or cabinet changes. Jaishankar remains highly popular and charismatic. You can see I have his book right behind me on the bookshelf over there. So I think, I would be surprised if he doesn't stay on. I think, I mean, he has been very good in articulating sort of this more muscular and assertive Indian foreign policy. And so I think, I would argue that it's very likely that he will stay on as foreign minister and continue to be a spokesperson for this more assertive foreign policy that we've seen under the Modi government.
Thanks, Chitij. We got a question from Chaitanya Raut about the UN Security Council permanent seat. They asked why the West isn't advocating for India and others to obtain a permanent seat. I mean, I think technically the UK and some others have said in statements that they want India to have a permanent seat. I'm not sure how committed they are to that beyond putting it in a statement, but I know it's in the BJP manifesto, I think, as well. Ambassador Sood, I mean, do you think is it ever going to happen? And how? I mean, how might India finally get hold of this UNSC seat? I mean, obviously they need the 5 members to agree, but how might they go about getting the West plus Russia and China on side?
Well, it is always very difficult to change institutional frameworks. And you're right when you say that UK, France, United States have been forthright in terms of saying that they support India as a permanent member of the Security Council. But then everybody has to agree, I mean, which includes, and then somehow or the other, there had been this kind of package which included Japan, which included Germany, and that is where it leads into difficulties because people then, there are some who will question um, German representation in addition to having Britain and France, and whether that is, reflective of today's geopolitics, or a representation from of Japan, which would then get China riled up. And let's say, I mean, China has never been forthright on the Indian position. In fact, till about 2008, roughly thereabouts, most Indian-Chinese joint statements would have a reference to the rise of Asia, the Asian century, and and Asia being large enough for both countries to rise together. Somewhere around 2008-9, that sentence got dropped, and you don't find it any longer in India-China joint statements. So this is where things sort of, you find a reflection in terms of how China sees its role. And I think this is because when India talks of a multipolar world, then what we are talking about is because we are in terms of a multipolar world, India feels that it can have a voice. For China, they would, at least for the moment, they would be content with a multipolar world, as long as it is a unipolar Asia. In Asia, they would not like to concede. They would like to have their same Monroe Doctrine that the US has in the Western Hemisphere. And for India, obviously, a China-led Asia is a more immediate concern than a US-led world. And I think that is part of the realpolitik that is driving if we look at West as, quote unquote, one, but is driving the relationship between India and the West.
Yeah, obviously no one likes to make predictions, but I do wonder if in 10 years, when we have a similar seminar, we'll still be talking about expanding the permanent seats on the UN Security Council. We'll have to see. We have a couple of questions from Esther Hall and my former boss, Victor Mallet, about, I guess, the West's bottom line when it comes to democratic backsliding in India. So I might ask you about this, Kate. I mean, do you think there is a point at which concerns about pressure on minorities and rights in India, and potentially the way India acts in the world, that may be seen by the West to be undemocratic? Is there a point at which that does start to destabilize or limit the West's desire to expand a relationship with India?
Thanks, Ben. I mean, it's a really great question. I think the important thing to realize is that cooperation without deep trust is possible when you're, pursuing the same ends, essentially, or you're facing a similar risk. It will be more transactional, though, and aspects of the relationship that depend on trust will be less kind of successful. I mean, we have to remember that India is the world's largest arms importer. Access to sensitive, high technology is something that India's always wanted and felt as if the West is kind of withheld. There's not much likelihood of kind of red lines from the West being moved on in those areas without the expanding trust. But I think what's interesting is not just that the West is having to think about where its bottom line is, but it's actually having to think about how it itself needs to change. And it speaks to another question in the chat, which I think is really pertinent. What's happening in the Indo-Pacific, I think, is worth watching, because we've got a sort of an effort by the United States, even if the idea originated with Japan, the United States is certainly trying to project a kind of liberal script into that space, freedom and openness. And what's really interesting is how India is kind of playing a really central role in negotiating what exactly is meant by freedom and openness in that space. Doing that because the Quad formation has given India a sort of a kind of equal status to the other partners. What the Quad can agree to and what it will focus on is sort of coming up against what India's interests and tolerance for kind of risk or confrontation with China is. So there's a clear sort of amount of negotiation there. There's certainly some, I guess, mutual accommodation happening. And maybe that is a microcosm for what we might see at a different sort of more global level into the future.
Thanks. And I think the Quad is a really interesting example because it'd be quite hard to imagine if it wasn't India having a Vietnam or an authoritarian state in the Quad. What would be, that gets to Ambassador Sood's point, what would be the kind of rhetorical wrapper that you would put around that? It would be very, very difficult. So I think it's an interesting case study. I might come to you, Ambassador Sood, next as we come shortly to wrap up with an interesting question from Partish Dubey on what can the West learn from India? I mean, particularly on this question of let's keep it to diplomacy and foreign policy, because that's what we're here to discuss. But what sort of lessons do you think that we could learn? I mean, I know in discussing these questions, it often sounds like some people get the impression we're trying to lecture, but we're not. So yeah, what should we be learning from how India engages in the world as our governments look to improve their effectiveness of their diplomacy?
Let me start answering this by pointing out one interesting fact. The West, as we look at it, yes, it is a collection of liberal democratic countries, but in its own structure, is it democratic? It exists because it is led by the United States, which is the hegemon, which is far, far bigger than any of the Western economies or any of the Western militaries. Would the West be able to hold together as a grouping without that hegemon? I think it is something to ponder over. And that, in a very philosophical sense, leads me to the idea that as long as the West, or the notion of the West, or as Eikenberry coined it, the liberal Western, the rule-based liberal order or whatever, as long as you have the US leading it, there comes a natural interest in a bipolar equation. No, it's almost a given because that ensures that leadership and that also brings the West much more closer together. Having said that, let me make my second point. There are a lot of challenges that we are seeing within the West to democracy as the Western countries themselves define it. And Viktor Orban is the one who has coined the term illiberal democracy, and he doesn't see anything wrong with it. He prides it. He uses it as a great banner. The European Union accepts it. There are a number of other European countries that have also tilted in that direction. The rise of the right wing in a number of Western European old democracies is something that is a matter of concern about which Western writers have written. What we saw in 2020, which was for the first time in the United States, a challenge to the peaceful handing over of power after an election, was, I never thought I would see something like that. So democracy as we have known it is being challenged in many different ways for different reasons. Now, in some cases, migration threats, economic challenges, whatever it is. But the idea that we could all live together in a semblance of equality and prosper together across boundaries, globalization, which was driving this notion. I mean, let's face it, there are economic revolutions, there are social revolutions, there are technological revolutions afoot, which are challenging all of these concepts. And somewhere, if we come back to this idea of a bipolar kind of a situation, then it makes things difficult because then if in the past India had India had the luxury of distance because you had the dividing line in Europe, East Germany, West Germany kind of thing. This time you won't have that luxury. And so it becomes that much more challenging to craft a foreign policy that addresses India's interests, that reflects a degree of continuity. And I think that is where that is going to take a lot of ingenuity and at the same time, a development of national capacities.
Thanks so much for that. And we do have plentiful discussions about the many problems facing our own democracies in the US democracy. And as for what can the West do without America, we may very soon have to work out what we do in that situation. And it may well be that we're falling back on terms like strategic autonomy and the like, which we've discussed today in a different context. So we're out of time, I'm afraid, but thanks so much to Ambassador Sood, to Kate Sullivan, to Estrada, and my colleague Chitij Bajpai. Thanks to everyone for joining us today. Chitij's paper is in the chat, the link there, it's on our website. Please read it, share it, and keep an eye out for future events in the weeks and months ahead. But have a great day, everyone. Thanks and goodbye.